Why didn't people in medieval Europe take care of their hygiene? Imagine narrow streets of a medieval city, thatched roofs, gray stone walls, and a suffocating smell that permeates everything around. Unwashed bodies, sewage right under your feet, water that you shouldn't wash in. This is how everyday life looked like in that era. But why? You've probably heard the myth that medieval Europeans didn't wash, were afraid of water, and hardly bathed once in their lives. But how true is this? Was cleanliness really considered an unnecessary luxury in those days? Or were there completely different reasons behind it? Religious dogmas, fear of disease, medical misconceptions, or maybe just a lack of conditions? What prevented people from taking care of their hygiene? Why did a society that built majestic castles and created great works of art live in unsanitary conditions that would horrify us today? Today, we will figure out how things really were with hygiene in medieval Europe, debunk myths, and find out why even the nobility could avoid water for months. Ready to learn the terrible truth? Then let's go. In medieval European cities, streets were not just roads, but real breeding grounds for dirt, stench, and disease. Majestic cathedrals and castles towering over cities coexisted with unbearable, unsanitary conditions. Stone pavements and narrow alleys were literally covered with waste, food scraps, sewage, slops, and even human excrement. In the absence of sewage, townspeople simply poured buckets of sewage right out of their windows, sometimes without even looking at who was walking below. In large cities, the streets were so polluted that after rain they turned into a viscous swamp filled with fetid sludge. But the most terrible thing was that for the residents of that time, this was the norm. They were accustomed to the constant stench, rats and flies swarming over the rotting remains of animals that were thrown right out onto the street. Sometimes the authorities tried to combat this by introducing rules prohibiting the dumping of sewage on the central streets, but most citizens simply ignored them. In some places, so-called night cleaners were hired to clean the streets of garbage, but their work was extremely irregular and ineffective. Stinking ditches and open sewers were common even in large cities. In many places, they replaced sewers, but instead of effectively removing sewage, they simply stagnated, becoming a source of unbearable stench and disease. There were no disinfection systems, and water from nearby rivers and wells was often polluted to such an extent that drinking it meant exposing yourself to mortal risk. This created ideal conditions for the spread of epidemics, which broke out every now and then, taking thousands of lives. But what is even more frightening is that even the wealthy nobility and royalty were not much different in terms of hygiene. Palaces and castles suffered from unsanitary conditions no less than city streets. Enormous halls with luxurious carpets and gilded walls hid disgusting realities behind their splendor. People defecated in the corners, and waste poured directly into the moats surrounding the castles. The stench was so strong that palace servants were sometimes forced to fumigate the premises with incense to at least slightly muffle the smell. Today, it is difficult to imagine life in such an environment, but for a medieval person, it was an everyday reality. No soaps, showers, or clean streets, only dirt, disease, and a persistent smell of decay that accompanied people throughout their lives. In medieval Europe, water could be more than just dirty. It could kill. In the absence of effective water purification systems, wells and rivers from which water was taken were often contaminated with waste dumped directly into them. Feces, animal carcasses, sewage, all of this flowed into the only sources of water that were available to people. Infections spread like wildfire, and no one knew about bacteria or that water could be the cause of mass diseases. Plague, dysentery, cholera. These terrible diseases were often transmitted through water, and to avoid infection, people began to look for an alternative. And this alternative was alcoholic beverages. Weak beer, diluted wine, ale. These were everyday drinks for both adults and children. Yes, even babies drank beer instead of water. Unlike water, beer was fermented, which destroyed most of the harmful bacteria, and therefore was considered safer. Even monasteries, which played a huge role in society in the Middle Ages, brewed their own beer, and it was considered part of their culture. Rich people drank expensive wine, but even the poor tried to avoid water, drinking at least weak ale. This led to the fact that most of the population of Europe was in a state of constant alcoholic intoxication, albeit mild. Workers started the day with a mug of beer, artisans took a break for another portion, and nobles washed down their food with wine at dinner. In conditions when water could be considered poison, alcohol became a kind of panacea. Even the church, which strictly condemned drunkenness, recognized that drinking beer and wine was a forced necessity. Of course, there were those who continued to drink water, but it was a kind of lottery ticket. One sip from a contaminated well, and a person could get a fatal disease. But the worst thing is that people did not know what exactly causes these diseases. They could blame demons, evil spirits, heavenly punishment, but not the microbes that were slowly killing them with every drop of dirty water. Today it seems crazy to us that children could start the day with beer, but in the Middle Ages it was the norm. And if someone had offered to drink regular water, they would most likely have looked at him as if he were crazy. After all, in the eyes of a medieval person, water was much more dangerous than alcohol, and he was right. In those days, it was alcoholic drinks that saved millions of lives. In the Middle Ages, people not only avoided bathing, they sincerely considered it dangerous to life. Water, which was supposed to cleanse the body, was perceived as something that, on the contrary, weakened it, making it vulnerable to diseases. Doctors of that time warned that a hot bath softened the skin, opened the pores, and through them, putrefactive miasmas could easily penetrate the body, invisible harmful vapors which, in their opinion, were the cause of fatal diseases. Dirt, on the contrary, was considered a kind of protective shell that blocked the impact of external threats. This strange logic led to the fact that bathing became a rare phenomenon even among the nobility. Chronicles have preserved references to monarchs who took a bath literally a few times in their entire lives. King Louis XIV, known for his luxury and love of palace ceremonies, avoided bathing and preferred to mask the smell with incense and perfume. The Spanish Queen, Isabella of Castile, proudly declared that she washed herself only twice in her entire life, at birth and before her wedding. But the worst thing was that even if a person decided to wash himself, he did not always have the opportunity to do it safely. The water available in cities was often the same as the waste was dumped into, and therefore during rare bathing, people could become infected with deadly diseases. This only increased the fear of the bath, and many preferred to simply avoid contact with water. Instead of bathing, they used dry cleaning. They rubbed the body with a cloth, sprinkled flour or powder on the hair to absorb fat, and then carefully combed it to remove dirt. Public baths, popular since the time of the Roman Empire, gradually turned into places of debauchery, and then completely became breeding grounds for infections. When Europe faced an epidemic of plague, the baths were closed, and doctors began to claim that water spreads infection. This was the final verdict on hygiene. Dirt was no longer just a side effect of everyday life, it had become a protective barrier, the removal of which was considered dangerous. The smell in medieval cities was so unbearable that the aristocracy was forced to wear handkerchiefs soaked in aromatic oils in order to somehow survive social gatherings. Palaces filled with luxury stank no worse than simple peasant houses, because even in the royal chambers there was rarely clean water. At some point, unwashed bodies became the norm, and smelly clothes ceased to embarrass others. After all, everyone smelled the same. Medieval people were in no hurry to take a bath, and even the idea of immersion in water was viewed with suspicion. The belief that water washes away the natural protective layer of the skin and makes the body vulnerable to disease was so strong that bathing was considered not just an unnecessary luxury, but an outright risk. Instead, people relied on clothing, believing that it was responsible for the cleanliness of the body. The more often you change your shirt or dress, the cleaner you become. This logic prevailed in medieval society, especially among the nobility who could afford to change clothes. Skin covered in sweat, dirt and grease, no big deal if you put on a fresh linen shirt on top. It supposedly absorbed all the impurities, meaning the body would remain clean. This strange principle of hygiene existed for centuries, while real water remained somewhere beyond the bounds of reason. it was trusted much less than a good piece of fabric. They didn't wash their heads either, they decorated them. In the era of lush wigs and elaborate hairstyles, hair became something like a building material. Wash it with water? Why? If you can just pour fat on it, powder it, and add fragrant essences on top so that the smell was not felt. Rich nobles could wear a wig for weeks, which over time turned into a real reserve for lice. Scratching your head is also not a problem, because there's always an elegant silver stick at hand, designed specifically for this. The most inventive in this matter were the French aristocrats of the 17th century, who brought the art of refusing to wash to perfection. They used perfume in unimaginable quantities, soaked wigs in animal fat so that they retained their shape, and resorted to all sorts of tricks just to avoid encountering water. Instead, legends were born that bathing could lead to fatal diseases, and excessive cleanliness was a sign of weakness. It so happened that for a medieval person, a fresh shirt, a generously powdered wig, and a few drops of aromatic oil on the wrist replaced both a shower and soap, and basic ideas about hygiene. Water was frightening, fabric saved, and fat and powder served as a protective barrier. And no one even thought about the fact that in fact this was not cleansing, but only a disguise of centuries-old dirt, which was firmly absorbed into the life and habits of people. Medieval cities were not just dirty, they were deadly. The stench hanging over the streets mixed with the fumes of rotting food, sewers, and decomposing animal bodies. The smell of decay, dampness, and human excrement became the natural background of life, but no one then thought that it was in this filth that an invisible killer lurked. Diseases rushed through the cities like fire through dry grass. One outbreak, and tens of thousands were dead. One rat, and in a few years, Europe would lose a third of its population. The rats that swarmed the streets, alleys, and even houses were only part of the horrific picture. They were impossible to eradicate. They fed on the garbage that was everywhere on the roads. They climbed into houses in search of food, and no one suspected that death was traveling on their backs. Fleas, carrying the plague bacteria, jumped from one rat to another, from rodents to people. The bitten person did not yet know that he was already doomed. First, fever. Then, terrible black abscesses. Then, painful death. And the worst thing, no one understood how to stop it. Doctors dressed in terrible leather cloaks and masks with long beaks carried aromatic herbs in these noses, convinced that diseases were transmitted through bad smells. They believed that the air, filled with the stench of decay, infects people in itself. That is why they tried to fight epidemics not with hygiene and disinfection, but with aromatic oils, herbal fires, and even fumigation of houses and streets with smoke. Sometimes the sick were literally walled up in their own homes, leaving them to die alone, so that the infection would not break out. The plague broke out again and again, in different countries and in different centuries, and no one knew when it would strike next. Fear was everywhere, but the filth remained unchanged. People continued to live, surrounded by filth, continued to believe that illness was the cause of death itself, but they did not guess that the cause was hidden under their feet, in the very filth with which they had long ago resigned themselves. It seemed that dirt and stench had become an integral part of the life of a medieval person, but changes were already beginning to brew. The closer the end of the Middle Ages came, the more people began to realize that unsanitary conditions kill. City dwellers began to notice that those who washed their hands more often got sick less often, that water, if boiled, could be less dangerous, and streets cleared of waste were less likely to become hotbeds of epidemics. These changes did not happen overnight, but step by step, Europe began to realize the importance of cleanliness. A real breakthrough occurred during the Renaissance, when a return to the ancient ideal of beauty and harmony affected not only art, but also the attitude towards the body. People began to take an interest in Roman bathing traditions again, and separate rooms for water treatments began to appear in the homes of the nobility. Of course, it was still a long way from the bathrooms we are accustomed to, but the very idea of personal hygiene began to penetrate society. Kings and aristocrats, who had previously simply doused themselves with perfume to mask the smell, now began to install bathtubs and even order soap, which had previously been considered a luxury item. But it was not only noble persons who began to change their habits. The development of trade made soap available even to ordinary people. Previously, it was brewed in a handicraft way, and it cost a lot of money, but by the 16th century, production had become simpler, and more city dwellers could afford this important item. However, the habit of dirt, ingrained over centuries, did not disappear immediately. Many still believed that frequent washing was harmful, and water could soften the body and make it vulnerable to disease. Meanwhile, the scientific revolution turned the world upside down. Doctors began to conduct the first experiments, studying the effect of cleanliness on health. The first hypotheses appeared that diseases could be transmitted not only through bad air, but also through touch, clothing, and dirty water. Of course, the discovery of bacteria was still a long way off, but the idea that a person could prevent illness by simply maintaining cleanliness was becoming more and more popular. Towards the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the New Age, cities began to change. In France and England, the first sanitary rules requiring street cleaning began to be introduced. In Italy, public baths appeared that even commoners could use. Bathing ceased to be the preserve of a few and gradually became a habit, although for many years it was perceived with caution. Thus ended the era when stench and filth were considered the norm. But traces of medieval dirt remained in European culture for a long time. Even in the 18th century, some people continued to be afraid of water, and the habit of using perfume as a means of masking odor lived on for centuries. However, with each new decade, humanity increasingly realized that cleanliness is not just a whim, but a matter of life and death. Life in a medieval city was far from the romantic notions of knights and castles. Dirt, stench, diseases, all this accompanied people daily, and they did not even realize how dangerous their usual environment was. Today we take cleanliness for granted, but imagine that you had to find yourself in that world. Would you be able to withstand the level of unsanitary conditions that were the norm for a medieval person? Or perhaps we still underestimate hygiene and its impact on our lives. History shows that even the most mundane things, such as cleanliness, have come a long way in evolution. Who knows, maybe in a few centuries, people will look at our modern habits with the same horror. If you like this video, be sure to like it, subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new releases, and check out other videos. We have many more exciting stories. What do you think about hygiene in the Middle Ages? Write in the comments, let's discuss.